Most coding languages will require us to declare a variable before we can start working with them. And with JavaScript, this is no different. Well, actually, it is a little different. So let me show you some code. I have here on the left Visual Studio Code running. I have a page that I have created that I'm running here on the browser. And that page is just linking a JavaScript file where I can just log in information and just make any tests that I need from here. So if I save my file, I can see any log here on the right. So with that, let's say I want to declare a variable called username. Then I can set to this username any value that I want. So let's say John. And then I can log this information here on the console. So let's say username. If I save, I get John here on the DevTools on Google Chrome. Here I am declaring a variable. I am using console log to display the value of that variable. If I want to, I could even include more than one value inside this console log. So let's say I also want to include a label called name, and then use comma to separate. So if I save, I get name and I get the value from my variable. JavaScript will allow me to declare variables before I can start working with them, but this is actually not a requirement. If I don't declare a variable and I save, you can see I still get the exactly same result. So declaring a variable is not a requirement in JavaScript unless I declare that to JavaScript just saying use strict. If I save, the browser will understand now that I want the browser to validate my variables, and just so the variable starts to be a requirement. For declaring a variable, for years we have been using var and just declaring the variable that I want to use. If I save, that works fine. I can declare a variable in one line, assign a value to that variable on another line, or I can do both on the same line. I can declare the variable and assign a value. Once I save, I still get the exactly same result. However, with JavaScript, we had this var statement where we use for declaring variables. This was created at the beginning of JavaScript, but it has a lot of issues. Let me show you an example. Back to the code, let's say I want to create a for loop where I'm going to set I as 0, loop until I is less than 0, and from inside I just want to log I, and also I want to log I from the outside. So I am creating a variable to be used inside this block, and for most languages I would be available only for inside this block. But for JavaScript, that doesn't happen. If I save this code, you can see that I do get all the logs from inside, where I get each interaction from I, but I also get the value from I from the outside, which is an issue, because if I have declared this variable, I am expecting this variable to be destroyed at the end of this loop, and therefore releasing some space in the memory. However, that doesn't happen. The variable is still alive even after the for loop is finished, and that could generate some issues for my application if I start creating a lot of variables, which we do. So to solve this issue, they have released a new statement for declaring variable. Actually, they have released two different ones. One of them is the statement let. Let does exactly what var does, except that it's going to be restricted to a block. So let's say instead of using var, I'm going to use let. If I save, you can see that now I get this error. I get the interaction from inside the block. This is when I is still alive. And then when I get from the outside, I is no longer available because it was destroyed, which is what we want that to happen. What if I do need to have access to I even after the interaction of the loop? Well, in this case, I could simply declare I before the loop, I use the I inside from that, and I get that result. But that's my option as a developer. once I need to do that, I'm going to do this way. Otherwise, I expect JavaScript to get rid of that variable. And as I mentioned, another way for us to declare variables is also using the const statement. This statement will behave much like the let statement. So let's say for this first variable where I declare the username Mary, so let me change to use let username Mary, and then I console log that information. Let's say that later I want to change the username to be John, and then I could log that same information. And if I save, you can see that I get name Mary, and then after that I get name John because I have reassigned that variable. Let's say I don't want that to be possible. I don't want to allow developers to reassign a variable. This is when we use the const statement. Const will say that this variable cannot be reassigned. So if I save now, you can see that I get an error on line 5, which is exactly where I am trying to reassign the value of this variable. I just needed to be careful because the const statement is kind of different from the const statement from many other languages. It's not exactly for creating a constant variable. In most languages, a constant is a variable that cannot be changed no matter what. This is not what happens on JavaScript. In JavaScript, whenever we declare a variable using the const statement, we are just saying that I cannot reassign that value, but I still can make changes to that. Let me show you an example. So let's go back to that same code where I am trying to reassign the username to be John. Let's say that instead of being a string, I'm creating this as an object, and inside this object I'm going to set name as being Mary. And then later I want just to change username dot name to be John. If I save, you can see I am not getting any error, and instead I am reassigning from Mary to John. You can see once I expand here, I get the updated value. Even though the initial one was Mary, the updated one is now John. So constants inside JavaScript, that doesn't mean I cannot change a variable. That just means I cannot reassign the variable. If I try to go and say username receive a new object, it could even be an empty object, now I get that error. So just be careful about that, because whenever we use a const, that doesn't mean I cannot change, I just cannot reassign. But then, which one should I use? Should I use var? Should I use let? Should I use const? It depends on the scenario. Well, for a start, var, never. Never use var, because this is an old statement. It had, as I mentioned, a lot of issues. It was replaced. So now we need to choose between const or let. As a rule of thumb, let's always use const, because whenever I create a variable, I don't have the intention of reassign. Most of the time I don't need to reassign a variable. I just need to update its value, and with React we are going to see that we can reassign even string even though it is a const. So always use const to avoid mistakes. Sometimes we are going to try to reassign a variable which we shouldn't, and that could break our React application. So always use const. If whenever you are making some tests, you see that this is an issue, that you are getting the error where you need to reassign that variable, then you can start thinking, why I am trying to do that? Do I really need to reassign that variable? Should I create a new one? Most of the time you realize that you shouldn't be reassigning, you should be creating a different one, a temporary one, and use that other one. However, sometimes you will come to the conclusion, no, I really needed to change that one, so then you should use let. One example for this, a clear one, is if I am using this for loop. So if I go back here to use this as being a let, you can see that, oops, let me just get rid of this change. So you can see that I get this error once I try to go from the outside, but from the inside it works perfectly. If I try to use a const here, this is a clear example where I'm going to have a failure because the for loop is going to try to reassign that. So for statements, we need let. Most of other scenarios, we don't need to use let. A const statement will be fine. So this is how we are going to be approaching our course using const most of the time. As for variable names, always use short names, but clear ones. Don't try to declare variables that the other developers would not understand what you are trying to do there. So always create a clear identifier and always using camel case, where we start with a lowercase, but every new word inside that variable, we should start with an uppercase, just so we make it clear to the developers that what is the name that I'm using for that variable. Also, related to variables, we have data types. JavaScript has some primitive data types like string, number, boolean, undefined, and null. Most of the time, JavaScript will not make difference between them unless we use TypeScript, which is something we are going to take a look into later. However, there is one complex data type called objects, and this is one that we use most while coding. So we are going to be using primitive data, but we are going to also are going to be using a lot of objects inside our applications. And as for string, we have template literals.